Log on, tune in, find out. Another good idea from Cambridge.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I think we are approaching the hour that we need to start the proceedings. First, thank you very much on behalf of Faculty of Economics and Cambridge Finance for coming to this important lecture, which is going to be given by Professor Paul Krugman. Professor Krugman, I'm sure, is known to all of you. That's why you are here. And he not only won a Nobel Prize, Nobel Memorial Prize in Economics 2008 for his contribution in the trade theory and growth, but also he has been very important, influential figure in the public policy debate and has been doing the columns in the New York Times, which we all read and enjoy, and hopefully people take notice of it more than what they do, as they should, in my opinion. And it is my pleasure to invite Professor Paul Krugman to come to the podium and give his talk. He's going to talk about 45 minutes, and we're going to have maybe another 45 minutes for questions and answers. He's agreed to answer the question, but we are going to finish not at 7:30, but 7 o'clock sharp. Professor Paul Krugman.
There's a great website which has PowerPoint versions of great historic speeches, and the PowerPoint version of Gettysburg Address, which government bullet point of by and for people, begins with Lincoln spending about 5 minutes fighting with the technology. So here we go. Okay. Wow, this is an extraordinary honor. What could be a higher point for an economist than to be asked to talk about Keynes here on the 75th anniversary? And I guess the obvious question that's raised then is, what am I doing here? Because as those of you who know my academic work know, I have not primarily been a macroeconomist, and the work I have done on macroeconomics until the late 1990s was pretty much all international finance, which is a subject notably absent from the general theory, as some of us were saying during the conference earlier today. I think the reason I'm here is really two things. One is that probably I was among the first fairly well-known economists to realize circa 1998 that what was happening in Japan then and what is happening to all of us now was something important, that in fact we were in the process of discovering that the kinds of problems that Keynes worried about, the kinds of problems that the general theory of employment, interest, and money was about, were problems that were neither myths nor historical curiosities of interest only to scholars of the interwar years, but were actually something that could happen in the modern world and were in fact happening in the modern world. And I guess the other reason I'm here is that I have become a particularly annoying public intellectual in recent years, which means that I play a big role in these debates, but also I probably have more sense than many of my professional colleagues of what the actual policy debate out there in the world is like. Actually, we've had some discussions during the conference, and people have been saying, well, there are certain things that everybody knows, and to which the answer is, well, I think I talk to a larger subset of everybody than you do, and it ain't so. So that, I think, is why I'm here. So what I want to do in this talk, I really want to do four things. I should, by the way, add that I am in no way, shape, or form a Keynes scholar, not an intellectual historian or a historian of any kind. So that's also, this is not what I'm going to do. That said, I want to talk briefly about reading Keynes, about how should one read Keynes? What should we draw from reading him? Then considerably greater length about the way in which the very same debates that Keynes was trying to resolve in the general theory 75 years ago are playing out all over again in much the same way right now. About the reappearance in a way that this turns out not to be a completed chapter of argument, but something we have to do all over again. Then I want to talk some about what isn't in the general theory, what isn't in that piece of Keynes anyway, and some of the things that seem to us now to be quite important in making sense of the world we're in. And last, I want to talk about the unhappy story of how it is that we're having to fight the old battles all over again, and some thoughts about how we ended up in the mess we're in. So, as I said, let me talk a bit about reading Keynes. If you read the people who read Keynes, if you read the discussion, what you pretty quickly find out is there's vast dispute about what it was that Keynes really meant. And that's a dispute I have no intention of getting into. There's an old story about a visitor to a museum in Washington, I guess, who looked at a portrait of George Washington and asked the museum guard, "Is that the way he really looked?" And the museum guard responded, "Madam, that's the way he looks now." That's my view of Keynes, that what he really meant, that's an interesting question, but not for people like me. The question is, what do we make of Keynes now? What does he mean how do we use Keynes now? Even within that, I think there are two broadly two ways that people read Keynes, which I think of as chapter 12ers and part 1ers. If you've actually read the general theory, chapter 12 is by far the best written chapter of the book. It's a chapter it's called the state of long-run expectations, but that's a very misleading, that doesn't give you any clue to just how much fun it is. It's the story about how people make investment decisions, and about the fundamental theme is that actually nobody knows anything about the long-run future, but they adopt conventions to convince themselves that they know something, and then every once in a while those conventions collapse and wild things happen. And it's full of acute observations about investor psychology. There's the famous description of investment as being like one of those contests in which you are not supposed to pick the most beautiful woman in the photograph, but to pick the woman that the most other people in the contest will also pick, and that sort of stuff. And it's a great read, and there's a lot of wisdom in it. And many people who read Keynes believe that that's the message, and that anyone who does who does something they call Keynesian but is not like that, but is instead kind of little mathematical models with equilibrium conditions and convergence and stuff, which would include a list of people running from John Hicks to Paul Samuelson to Mike Woodford, right in front of me, is desecrating the memory of Keynes. And then there's the part 1ers who look at Keynes and say, well, that's great stuff in chapter 12, but part 1, which is where the book opens, is really about, it's about basically the possibility of not having enough demand in an economy. It's about the possibility that there just isn't enough spending, and that the economic problem becomes not how can we produce, but how can we persuade people to spend enough to make use of the productive capacity we have. And for those who follow this stuff, it's about Say's law and the falsity of Say's law and all of that. And if you want to say, well, that's not what Keynes is really like, and all those little mathematical models and equilibrium conditions, that's not Keynes, then you have the reality that there are passages in Keynes that look like this, which sure looks like actually fairly klutzy math, but it's not going to run through it. But he certainly would do things like this, and they say, well, look, there's other stuff in there, but this is what we need to be understanding. So I personally am basically a part 1er, except with a lot of Chapter 13 and 14 thrown in as well. Chapter 13 and 14 are about interest rates, and I'll have a lot to say about that in a little while. Which is not to say that Chapter 12 is, that there isn't something in there too. Oh, by the way, we have one authority who did declare that the general theory is really about the ideas in Chapter 12, an authority not to be totally ignored, because it's Keynes himself who wrote a little piece summarizing his theories, allegedly for the Quarterly Journal of Economics in the United States, the year after the book was published, in which he said it's all about the instability of the state of long-run expectation and so on. Well, I guess that's his opinion. The point is that it doesn't matter. Well, what is the book really about? That's an interesting question for someone else. For what we need to know, a lot of it, at least for me, is the part one and follow-up. Now, okay, which then brings me to, why is this stuff still important? Okay, so you established that it's possible to have a shortfall of demand. Surely we must all understand that right now, and there can't be any real problem with that. And surely that's not where the debates lie. Except it turns out that out there in the world of argument over policy, that pretty much is where the debates lie right now. It's not a question of some finer points. I think that's one of the problems that a lot of professional economists in the academic world have, is that we do think that the cutting-edge research issues must be the ones that are really important to resolve. And in practical terms, and even, I'm afraid to say, among our colleagues, it's the very basic fundamental things where we often run aground. So the notion that, let's put it this way, the insights that come in quite early, basically come in within the first 3 chapters of Keynes, and of those, by the way, Chapter 1 is only 1 page long, so they come on very early in the book, are actually where a lot of the battleground of policy debate is taking place. Partly that's because, to the extent that people have any idea at all what was in Keynes, they often have a very sort of crude, naive, a crude reductionist view that misses the whole point. So you'd have somebody say something like this, that all right, John Maynard Keynes thought that the problem lay with wages and prices that were stuck at excessive levels, which could be fixed by expansionary monetary policy. And so it's trivial, right? Wages are too high, so in money terms, and so you just have to print more money, and that'll solve your problem. And that's all of Keynesian economics. There's nothing else to be understood there, which is, of course, quite wrong, and totally wrong in a situation like the one that the United States or the UK is in, where monetary policy is, at least conventional, just printing money does nothing because interest rates are zero. Okay, who said that? That's actually Robert Barrow in the Wall Street Journal in January 2009 against fiscal policy. The point is, this is, eminent colleagues are doing that kind of simplistic stuff. And that's a sign that we really have not got our Keynes under our belt here. The basic message of part one is basically that there's no guarantee that people will spend enough to make use of an economy's productive capacity. There's no guarantee that just because we can produce stuff, that people will spend the income that would be generated if we were in fact producing that stuff, and thereby create enough demand. And that there is, therefore, there's actually very little about policy in the general theory, but it's all by implication, that therefore there's a case for policy stepping in there, the government stepping in to spend, or in some other way encouraging people to spend. The chapter 2 of the general theory is, and quite a lot of the general theory is written in the form of an argument with the classical economists. And that's kind of an ever-shifting set of people. And so there's this question, was Keynes caricaturing their views? Were there any people who actually misunderstood things as badly as he claimed the classics did? And again, that's a dispute that the intellectual historians can have. My view is I'm pretty sure that Keynes was right in construing those views. And the reason I'm pretty sure of that is because we have this very same arguments popping up today. And so we have Keynes went on at some length about people who have the words are the notion that if people do not spend their money in one way, they will simply spend it in another. That income must be spent. That's just of course, the money has to go somewhere, and therefore, among other things, there couldn't possibly be any role for an expansionary fiscal policy because, if the government spends money, it's taking money that the private sector would have spent anyway. It's either going to come at the expense of consumption, or if people were saving that money, that saving was going to flow to, into the banks and then onto firms, and of course it would be spent. There's nothing you could do. And, of course, nobody would be so naive as to believe that now. Well, of course they would. By the way, this is a little bit, I don't really have it in for anybody here. But to make it clear that I'm not talking about straw men, I have to have real examples, right? So here we are. First, if money is not going to be printed, if the government borrows $1 from you, that is $1 that you do not spend or that you do not lend to a company to spend on new investment. Every $1 of increased government spending must correspond to one less $1 of private spending, and so on down the line. And this is just accounting. It does not need a complex argument about crowding out. Okay, that is John Krugman of the University of Chicago, also writing in 2009. It's a recent statement by someone who's regarded as a highly qualified economist. And it is exactly the fallacy that Keynes identified, which is confusing an accounting identity, which is in the end income must equal spending, with a causal relationship, which is that income must be spent. Not the same thing, not at all the same thing. And by the way, this particular argument, this is a key part of the US political debate. Read what's coming out of the Cato Institute or Heritage Foundation. Read the speeches of Republican members of Congress opposing fiscal stimulus, and you'll hear them saying again and again, the government cannot create spending. A dollar that the government spends is a dollar less spending by the private sector, and saying this as a logical point, not as an empirical argument, but just as a matter of logic. This argument. This is for those. This is the Treasury view here of 1930, but the Treasury view in completely unchanged form. Exactly, the old Treasury view is an important part of the U.S. policy debate in the year 2011. How do we know this is wrong? I have I don't know how many people here are economists, probably quite a few anyway, but actually that doesn't even mean that you'll know what I'm about to show you. But anyway, I have a highly sophisticated, very deep, cutting-edge 21st century thing. It's called the 45-degree diagram, which we all used to learn, but maybe only of us above a certain age. I actually suspect only people who are no more than 2 or 3 years younger than I am actually learned. Actually invented by Paul Samuelson, although very close. If you actually can read the quite badly written Chapter 3 of the General Theory, it basically does tell the story, which says that spending by everybody is an increasing function of income, because people are richer, they'll spend some more of the money, but not all of it. And that always, of course, the economy ends up on that 45-degree line where income equals expenditure, which says, okay, there's an accounting identity that says that income equals spending, but if you increase the amount that people are willing to spend at any given level of income, shift that thing up, then you will actually move to a higher level of income. And that is that shows you just very simply that the accounting identity does not mean that an increase in spending by the government must come at the expense of private spending. Actually, on the contrary. But actually nobody, maybe people get this in their undergraduate courses. I think this is not taught at all in graduate school. And so in fact, nobody knows this stuff. Okay. I think a much more, again, as I want to say, even this stuff plays a significant role in the policy debate. But a more subtler thing is the whole issue of interest rates and the relationship between saving, investment, interest rates. And that's actually something where, at quite high levels of discussion, people don't get it. And we're actually reading Keynes. If you can actually understand what he was saying, and to a large extent what John Hicks was saying about what Keynes was saying, and so on, is I think still shows that much of what we talk about when we argue about policy is just wrong. So let me walk through that a little bit. I think most people who know, some economics, don't need to know a lot, who try to think about interest rates, think about, well, it's supply and demand for funds, right? And it is. I mean, so you have something like this. Given the interest rate, the amount of investment, the lower the interest rate, the more people will want to spend on investment. The higher the interest rate, the more people will want to save. Maybe there's some complications there, but just take that. So there's supply of saving, a demand for those savings to be invested, and the interest rate is where those things cross. And this is not wrong. The natural thing to do, though, is to say, well, then if the government is going in and borrowing, that's an extra demand for saving, or if you like, it's a reduction in the supply of saving that's available to the private sector, and surely that then is going to drive up interest rates. And it's not too much of a leap to go from that to saying, well, that must mean that if the government is out there borrowing, it's going to be driving up interest rates, which is actually going to hurt the economic recovery. So we better bring deficits down to make sure that interest rates stay low so that we can have an economic recovery. And again, just to tell you, I'm not inventing straw men, something like this. You can't be a monetarist and a Keynesian simultaneously. I don't see how you can, because the aim of the monetarist policy is to keep interest rates down, to keep liquidity high. The effect of the Keynesian policy must be to drive interest rates up. Okay, so that's Neil Ferguson in a debate that Robin, my wife, and I, and a bunch of other people had sponsored by the New York Review of Books, also in early 2009. What's wrong with that view? Well, this is again Keynes on the classical theory of interest and why it was wrong. And why it's wrong is, while that thing is true, those curves don't stay put. If the economy expands, income will be higher, some of that income will be saved, also possibly investment demand will shift. And here Keynes explained it with this diagram, which is all perfectly clear. Actually, I don't think anybody ever accused Keynes of being a lucid maker of diagrams. This has got to be, I think, it's one of there are many unique and remarkable things about the general theory, and this might be the worst economic diagram I've ever seen. Okay, here's my version. This is just saying, suppose income rises. Savings will, other things equal at any given interest rate, people will save more because they have more income. Probably also firms will want to invest more because there'll be more demand, but normally, though we don't know this for sure, the place where they cross will be lower, so the interest rate would be lower. What this is doing is actually telling you that which is the point Keynes was making in that horrible diagram, that there's no unique level of interest rate that matches savings and investment. It depends on something else, namely the level of income in the economy. And the other way to say this is actually, and this is the way we more often think about it, that the lower the interest rate, the higher will be the level of GDP. And that's a schedule. That doesn't tie it down. That's just a relationship, something like this. And that's the IS curve from John Hicks. It's a, okay, and of course this is, to some extent, some notion like this is what practical monetary policy is normally about. If the Fed or the Bank of England thinks the economy is too weak, it cuts the interest rate. If it thinks the economy is overheating, it raises the interest rate. And now we come into the reason why we're especially interested in Keynes right now. There is the possibility that zero is not low enough. And what if, in fact, a zero interest rate is not enough to get you to full employment? Well, that's the situation when it becomes something much more than just a question of there being too little money in circulation. It becomes a much harder policy problem. I want to say one more thing about this, which is that there's a way to think about this, to go back to the savings and investment, which is to ask how much would people want to save if we actually were at full employment? How much would businesses want to invest if we were actually at full employment? And what they look like is this. It's saying that at full employment, we would have a situation where, well, the interest rate should be negative. if you can't get a negative interest rate, which you can't because people will hold currency rather than lend it out, then you would have so if at a zero interest rate, there is an implied excess supply of saving. There's basically an economy that is depressed in the way that the U.S. economy or the U.K. economy is right now, is in effect an economy that has more savings than the private sector is willing to invest. It's an economy that's all dressed up with savings with nowhere to go. That has a lot of implications. And if this is the case, we don't get a lot of clean tests in economics, least of all in macroeconomics. If ideally we would have 1,000 planet Earths and we'd follow different policies with everything else being the same, and so we'd have controlled experiments in economic policy, and we never get to do it. But we do have, in this case, certainly we have a situation of an economy that is clearly up against the zero lower bound, and where we have, in fact, had massive borrowing by advanced country governments. And so your question is, so when we had that debate at, actually, it was at the Metropolitan Museum, I think, about policy in early 2009, it was, if the U.S. government borrows $1.7 trillion, how can that not drive up interest rates? And if you believe in the story I've just told you, you'd say, well, actually, it could very easily not drive up interest rates. So what's actually happened to the U.S. is that since basically that inflection point there, that's basically the fall of Lehman. So basically, since the collapse of Lehman, the U.S. federal government has actually sold about $4 trillion of debt to the private sector, which surely must have sent interest rates soaring, but actually not. 2.93 when I checked it this afternoon is the 10-year interest rate. Now that's a 10-year rate. The short rates are zero essentially. 10-year rates are not because the market expects that someday the short rates will go above zero, although the date at which that seems likely to happen keeps on receding further and further into the future. This is, can I say, it's not just, commentators I can find or some economists saying the wrong thing. Quite a few hedge funds and so on bet substantial amounts of money on the belief that all that borrowing would have to send interest rates soaring. And some of them, last year, Morgan Stanley actually apologized to its investors because it had been projecting that this rate would rise to 5.5% and didn't. So a lot of people, common sense, said very clearly that all this borrowing has to drive up interest rates. Keynesian theory said, no, it doesn't. And this is as close to a real test, a head-to-head test of views. And John Maynard Keynes, who may in the long run be dead, but his analysis came through with shining colors on this issue. Not quite ready to leave this subject, actually, because there's another thing I want to talk about. This has... And I didn't get into the slides because I didn't think enough about it, but given the discussion in the conference earlier today, I realized it's pretty important. International implications. Specifically, if you're in a situation where basically your problem is too much savings, what's the role of capital inflows from abroad? And this is where I would say almost everybody gets it wrong. Because people keep on saying, particularly in the U.S. context, well, we mustn't defend the Chinese because we need to have those Chinese keep buying our debt, because otherwise interest rates will soar. Well, that is, of course, exactly the same as that, again, we're back to that. We're back to the, if our problem really is too much savings relative to investment demand, then the Chinese, by basically adding to that pool of excess savings, are not doing us a favor. And they're not even keeping interest rates down. There's absolutely nothing in there. My friend Dean Baker, progressive economist in Washington, says that at the moment the Chinese have got an empty water pistol pointed at America's head, which is the clear implication of this analysis, and nobody gets it. I saw some solemn discussion on TV just a few days ago with a panel of experts saying, well, of course, the emerging markets, China in particular, are the only thing that are keeping the United States afloat with its debt burdens. No, they're not. They're not. If the Chinese should decide to stop buying our debt, we should send them a note of thanks, because this is again, the implication is that this is not Our problem is too much savings, too many people who want to buy treasuries, not too few. Keynes for the modern world. And I think you can safely say that nobody in a position of influence understands this. It's, I've spoken to them and tried, and still they don't understand it. Anyway, okay, so let us simultaneously despair over the state of the policy debate and marvel at Keynes, because that analysis, that 75-year-old analysis, is a spectacularly good guide to a lot of what's happening in the world of 2011, a better guide than 95% of the commentary you'll read in newspapers or see on TV. Commentator here, Martin accepted. What's not in the general theory? What's not in the general theory, as many people have noted, is there's remarkably little about banks and finance and the financial system and all of that. In fact, there's nothing at all about banking crises, about the possibility of bank failures and them disrupting the economy, which is a little odd because Keynes was aware of such things. In fact, he wrote a really wonderful essay in 1931 about the consequences of deflation and how they could destabilize banking systems, and exactly what happened in the United States, although not here. And that part of the explanation might be that the great bank crisis of 1931 was something that happened in a lot of places, but not especially in the UK. But I think also, and this is just guess, and I would ask the Keynes historians to weigh in on this. I suspect that he didn't want to muddy the message, that a focus on banking issues would have distracted from the central focus on how it is possible to not have enough demand. And in fact, I have a kind of a real-life example of that, which is in the discussion of Japan in the 90s, which is where a lot of us came into this. There was a very strong, much of the policy-oriented discussion was about Japanese banks and the non-performing loans and the zombie banks and all of that. And my impression then, and even more now, is that actually got people off track, because they came to view the Japanese problem as essentially a banking problem, and once you fix the banks, everything would be okay. And also because they failed to understand the omen that the Japanese crisis posed for the rest of us. Because if you thought it was all about those troubled banks and the failure of the Japanese to deal with it, you failed to recognize that what we'd actually seen was that those mythical monsters from the past, the zero lower bound, the deflation that you can't get out of, were real. Failed to see that it was not the specifics of the Japanese banking sector, but the broader problem of a macroeconomic trap, very much like Keynes diagnosed, that we should be worried about. That said, obviously in the current world, certainly understanding how we got into this, you can't do that without talking about the financial sector. Not going to say much about that, just to say that it's pretty obvious. So there turns out to be, there are lots of ways you can measure financial disruption, financial distress. One pretty simple one is to look at the spread on interest rates between less than stellar quality corporate bonds, BAA, and U.S. government debt, which has there are a number of things to recommend. That one is you can do it for long time series. Another is that it was in fact the key measure used in an analysis of the onset of the Great Depression by a fellow by the name of Ben Bernanke. You may have heard of him. So if you look at that series, they changed the bond interest rate. So I actually have two, but they're not very different. And you can see, there have been two great banking disruptions in American history. One was in the early 1930s, and the other one was just the other day. And surely, you can't tell the story of this crisis without talking about it. And vast amounts of very important, interesting work has been done on how that happened. The first one was a depository institution crisis. The recent one was largely a shadow banking crisis, all interesting stuff. What I would say, though, is that it's a little bit striking that measure of financial stress, and just about every other measure, was very severe for a period roughly from September 15, 2008 till March or April of 2009. The financial system was clearly dysfunctional for a period of maybe 7 or 8 months. I've actually taken to, I would trying to spread this as the technical name for it. This is the, oh God, we're all going to die period and the world economy. And that period is largely over. The financial institutions were bailed out, they were backstopped. You don't see a lot of signs of extreme stress in financial markets. But you also don't see anything that looks like a vigorous recovery in the advanced world. So what's going on? Lots of stories. My preferred story right now does focus on balance sheets beyond the banking sector. It's not just the financial sector. That what's really missing, if you like, what's really missing from a lot of what we've done in macro is balance sheets more broadly. In the case of the United States, and I think here, particularly household balance sheets. Extremely high levels of debt were built up, especially after 2000, but to some extent before, and now we're faced with this problem of deleveraging, which is what keeps us depressed for an extended period. The question you might ask is, how does that change the story? And I think it changes it in a couple of ways. One, which actually is in the general theory quite a lot, is that it makes the notion that it's about excessive wages even more foolish than it might have seemed otherwise. If the idea that if only workers would accept a pay cut, that would solve our problem. Well, there's something to that in normal circumstances if you think that there's a fixed money supply and lower wages will increase the real money supply and drive down interest rates. But that doesn't work at all when you're up against the zero lower bound. When the interest rates that are determined by the supply and demand of money are already zero, they can't fall anymore. So that doesn't work. But in fact, it's actually worse than that because wage cuts, the debt remains the same. And so if you cut wages, the debt burdens become even worse in real terms. And so we're actually, that Robert Barrow quote at the beginning is utterly wrong. The problem is not excessive wages, and wage cuts don't help. This is one of the things that is really, I think, is hard for people to discover here or to wrap their minds around is that in general, we're in a topsy-turvy, Alice through the looking glass world, right? There's the paradox of thrift, people trying to save more, actually leads to lower investment because it depresses the economy and reduces business investment, and lower wages actually reduce employment. So we really are in a really strange world, and this is part of it. And there is quite a lot of that in the general theory. Keynes did get that, although he did not talk about excessive debt levels inherited from the past as a drag on the economy, which I think is very much part of our story. I would say, however, at least my argument would be that the story in terms of balance sheets actually makes the case for fiscal policy stronger rather than weaker. Because the problem with the Keynesian fiscal policy, the argument you always get is, yeah, but when does it stop? Why won't we need this permanently? And how do you deal with the problem of ever-growing government debt? But if you say the problem is one of balance sheets in the private sector that need to be repaired, that does put a period on the thing. It does say, okay, what you're doing is you're buying time for those household balance sheets to be repaired. And so it gives you at least a better story about why Keynesian policies might be something that are not forever, but only to deal with a transition, although that transition may be a very, very long time. Okay. I think I've made it pretty clear that I think the state of discussion is pretty terrible. That in a lot of ways we would have been, I wouldn't actually say that we would be better off if nobody had done any work in economics after the general theory. I'd say we'd probably be better off if everyone had stopped in 1949 after Paul Samuelson published his first edition of his textbook. So how did we get into the mess we're in? And I'm running longer than I'm into, but that's, let's stay with it. So I have, we certainly, there are certainly people to be angry at, and by all means, let's. My president has been too timid. The European Central Bank seems determined to destroy the economy it oversees. And one half of my country's political spectrum is completely insane. So all of those things are true. But I also believe that I've convinced myself that we're actually, in some sense, we were probably fated to be in this position. What we came out with after World War II, after Keynesian economics had been absorbed by the economics profession and to some extent by the political consensus, was a sensible but I think an ultimately unstable system. We had a kind of policy and intellectual consensus that was very reasonable. In fact, is still pretty much what I believe, which was that you need to have active monetary and at times active fiscal policy to assure more or less full employment. And given that, you can mostly let the free market do its work. So a free market Keynesian view. That was a system that made a lot of sense, I think is in fact what wise policy looks like, but it was probably something that was bound to fall apart over time. It was unstable, and I would say in three ways. It was intellectually unstable, politically unstable, and financially unstable. So the intellectual instability. If you're an economist, it is kind of, every Principles of Economics textbook has two halves, micro and macro. And they're very different. The microeconomics part is full of maximizing behavior and fully clearing markets and everything works. And it's all derived from very sort of basic principles. The macroeconomics part is kind of ad hoc, and you sort of say, well, wages don't fall rapidly in the face of high unemployment. Why? Well, because they don't. And a lot of sort of ad hoc stuff, which is okay. You don't have to be. Certainly, for practical purposes, it's perfectly okay to. Models are not truth. The map is not the territory. And if you find that you need to use different modeling styles to make sense of different things, in the long run, yes, we want to make it all. In the long run, it's all going to be quantum mechanics, but that's a ways off. And so until we get there, that's fine. But it is uncomfortable. And you were going to, inevitably, economists were going to push at the boundary. And given what we like to do and what we know how to do, they're always going to try and push more micro into the macro. And so we've had this long-standing push to have more micro foundations for macro. And a really big push in the 70s to do that, which fundamentally failed. That is, I would say that the attempt to really have a fully micro-founded macro did not work. But by the time that was apparent or should have been apparent to anyone who could step back from it, too many people were too invested in it to turn back. And so what happened was we had a steady sort of degradation of, we threw away a lot of what we had previously known. It was quite intense. If you, back in 1980, Robert Lucas wrote actually a very hard to find piece, but the quotes from it are famous, about how anyone who tried to introduce Keynesian ideas into a seminar would be met with giggles and whispers. Sort of this completely caustic thing. And once you've gone down that route to say, oh, well, actually, there was some stuff in that old book that we probably should have remembered, becomes hard to use. And so what we had was a dramatic effect forgetting in a good part of the economics profession. This is guessing, but I would guess that something like 60% of the macroeconomics done in graduate schools in the United States knows none of this, knows none of what I'm talking about. And we just, I use the phrase, as you can tell, I'm not very diplomatic. I've been calling it a dark age of macroeconomics. Dark age as opposed to the barbarian, and the barbarians never knew about civilization. The dark ages are when you had it and you lost it again. So, so we've been in a dark age for a lot of, so that was the intellectual instability. Politically, it's perfectly possible to be a Keynesian and a conservative in other respects. In fact, Keynes himself, said that his stuff was moderately conservative in its implications, which it was at the time. At the time, what critics of the system were advocating was central planning, and he was saying actually no, mostly free market, but we need these policies to buck it up. And so that there was so that's intellectually possible, it's politically possible, but it's hard. It's always going to be the case that some people who really don't want the government playing a role in the economy, who don't want redistribution, are going to feel that Keynesian economics is the thin end of the wedge, that allowing that the government can do something useful in terms of promoting full employment is just the next step to having the Red Brigade seize the means of production, something like that. And so there's always going to be a political pushback, and that's been true all along. When William Buckley wrote God and Man at Yale, part of his critique was that religion had vanished from the curriculum, but the real horror was that they were teaching Keynesian economics at Yale in 1950. So that was going to lead, and with growing, with a turn to the right in politics generally, it was going to mean a pushback against Keynesian economics. But I should probably mention that some people have dug up an old article by Mikhail Koletsky, who argued that the business interests hate Keynesian economics because their stock in trade is to claim that do anything that might hurt them and it'll destroy confidence. And if you say, well, but we don't need confidence, the government can pump up employment, that takes away a big bargaining tool. And I think 3 years ago I would have dismissed that as sort of too over the top, and these days it sounds totally plausible. Listening to Jamie Dimon, it sounds totally plausible. Last thing is financial instability. And I think this comes back to the financial stuff that isn't in Keynes. I'm not sure if we're all Keynesians now, but those of us who are Keynesians now are also now all Minskyites. Hyman Minsky famously argued that there's a kind of a long cycle in which periods of relative calm in the economy make people increasingly careless. And what they do above all is build up leverage. And so people start borrowing, they get more leveraged, and eventually there comes a point when things are ready for the rude shock. They're ready for the Minsky moment, when people say, oh, that's too much leverage, or my favorite version is the Wile E. Coyote moment. For those not familiar with the classics, in the Roadrunner cartoons, there's always runs off the cliff about 8 steps, and then only when Wile E. Coyote looks down does he. So there comes a moment when people suddenly say, oh my God, those debt levels are excessive. I think that's pretty clearly what happened here. Particularly, we had the episode that we're still calling the Great Moderation, the period of relative calm in the major advanced economies between 1985 and 2007, which was possible partly because, although I said a lot of Keynes has been forgotten, we're in a dark age, but my version is that central banks were the monasteries of this dark age, where the old manuscripts were maintained and studied, and so central banks knew about it, and as long as the central banks could do it, could stabilize the economy with open market operations, we were fine. But sooner or later, because under the surface of that stability, leverage was building up, the financial system was getting wilder and wilder, the possibility was that we were ahead. Sooner or later, we were going to have a crisis too big to handle just with monetary policy. And that happened. And when it did, it turned out that we no longer had the intellectual or the political capital to deal with it effectively. And so we're in the mess we're in. Okay. The general theory concludes with this incredibly inspirational thing. Simultaneously caustic, witty, and inspirational, very Keynes, about madmen and authority, hearing voices in the air, practical men who are the slaves of defunct economists, and basically arguing that ideas are what matter, and although he doesn't actually say that, he actually says ideas are dangerous for good or evil. Certainly I as a graduate student took it to mean, that do good economics and that will eventually save the world. What do you say now that we've, 75 years after the general theory, found ourselves back in a similar situation, making the same old mistakes having all of the old fallacies back as policy doctrines. What do we say right now? It's tough. It's a little bit harder to feel motivated and good about what you're doing. So I guess you have to have a more have to console yourself that you don't really expect straight line progress in a field like economics, which is so bound up with interests, where there's so much money, so much political ideology at stake. But you have to have faith that doing good work does, over the long run, lead to better policy. And so I was going to say, I think the moral for economists is keep on plugging, but since I'm in England and I've been seeing a lot of stuff, this slogan everywhere, I think that the moral for economists is keep calm and carry on, and do the right thing, and eventually maybe it will sink in. Thanks.